In 1964, a black woman named Fannie Lou Hamer stood before the Democratic National Convention and told America something most white citizens had never heard before. She described being beaten nearly to death in a Mississippi jail cell for the crime of trying to register to vote. Her testimony was so powerful, so raw, that President Lyndon Johnson called an emergency press conference just to cut away from her speech. But it didn't work. The networks played her words again that night, and millions of Americans finally understood what black citizens in the South had been facing for generations. This is the story of how black Americans fought their way back to the ballot box after nearly a century of being locked out. It's not a story about laws changing on their own or politicians suddenly becoming enlightened. It's about thousands of people risking everything, town by town, march by march, lawsuit by lawsuit, until they forced the most resistant democracy on earth to finally honor its own promises. The battle didn't start in the 1960s. It started the moment Reconstruction ended and white supremacists began systematically stealing the vote from people who'd only just won it. After the Civil War ended in 1865, the 15th Amendment promised that voting rights could not be denied based on race. For a brief, shining moment, it actually worked. During Reconstruction, black men voted in massive numbers across the South. They elected black sheriffs, state legislators, lieutenant governors, and 16 black congressmen. In some counties, black voters were the majority, and they used that power to reshape their communities. But white Southerners never accepted it. By the 1870s, terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were riding through black neighborhoods at night, burning homes and murdering anyone who dared to vote or hold office. When federal troops finally withdrew from the South in 1895, the violence exploded. What followed wasn't just intimidation. It was a coordinated campaign to destroy black political power entirely. Southern states rewrote their constitutions specifically to get around the 15th Amendment. They couldn't legally say black people couldn't vote, so they created a maze of requirements that were almost impossible to pass. Mississippi led the way in 1890 with a new state constitution that introduced the poll tax and the literacy test. Other states copied the blueprint. Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina. One by one, they built the same walls. The poll tax meant you had to pay money, sometimes up to $2, just to register. That doesn't sound like much, but in a sharecropping economy where most black families survived on less than $300 a year, it was a fortune. And it was cumulative in some places. If you missed a year, you owed back taxes before you could vote again. Poor white voters were hit too, but states often included grandfather clauses. If your grandfather could vote before the Civil War, you were exempt. Since no black person's grandfather could vote before the war, the clause only protected whites. Then came the literacy tests. Registrars would hand black applicants impossible questions. Recite the entire state constitution from memory. Explain the meaning of an obscure legal clause. Count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. These weren't real tests. They were traps. Meanwhile, white applicants got simple questions or no test at all. The registrar decided who passed, and the registrar was always white. The results were devastating. In Louisiana, 130,000 black men were registered to vote in 18 out of 6. By 1904, after the new laws took effect, that number dropped to 342. In Alabama, black voter registration fell from over 180,000 to under 3,000. Across the South, millions of black citizens were erased from the rolls. And if the laws didn't stop you, the violence did. Lynchings spiked whenever black communities tried to organize politically. Between 1880 and 1940, more than 3,000 black Americans were lynched, many for the crime of registering to vote or encouraging others to do so. By the early 1900s, the system was locked tight. Black Southerners lived under what historians call the Jim Crow regime, a society built on legal segregation and enforced with terror. Voting was essentially impossible. Political power was gone, and the federal government did nothing. The Supreme Court upheld poll taxes and literacy tests, calling them reasonable regulations. Presidents ignored the violence. Congress stayed silent. For decades, it seemed like nothing would ever change, but black communities didn't give up, even when the law turned against them. Even when violence came to their doors, they kept organizing. They built institutions that would eventually break the system wide open. The fight back started quietly in churches and community groups, in small towns where people gathered in secret to talk about their rights. The NAACP, founded in 1909, became the legal arm of that fight. For years, they chipped away at segregation laws in court, case by case, knowing that every small victory mattered. One of the first major wins came in 1944, with a case called Smith versus Allwright. The issue was the white primary, a system used across the South, where the Democratic Party, which controlled Southern politics, only allowed white people to vote in its primary elections. Since the Democratic primary was the real election in the one-party South, this meant black voters had no say in who actually held power. Lonnie Smith, a black dentist in Houston, Texas, sued after being turned away from a primary election. The NAACP took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a stunning decision, the court ruled that white primaries violated the 15th Amendment. Political parties, the court said, were not private clubs. They were part of the state's election system, and they couldn't exclude voters based on race. The ruling sent shockwaves through the South. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of black voters could participate in primaries. In Texas alone, black voter registration jumped from 30,000 to 100,000 within a year. It wasn't a total victory. Poll taxes and literacy tests were still in place. But the white primary was one of the biggest tools of exclusion, and now it was gone. Still, progress was agonizingly slow. Registrars found new ways to block black applicants. Intimidation continued, and the laws that remained, the poll taxes and literacy tests, were still declared constitutional by the Supreme Court. The NAACP kept fighting, but they knew legal victories alone wouldn't be enough. Then came Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, a case that wasn't directly about voting, but shook the entire Jim Crow system to its core. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine that had justified decades of racial oppression. The decision was massive. It told the South and the country that segregation itself was illegal. White Southerners responded with rage. Governors vowed to defy the ruling. Legislatures passed laws to block integration. Citizens' councils, white supremacist groups of businessmen and politicians organized across the region to resist change by any means necessary. But the ruling also gave black Americans something powerful: momentum. If segregation could fall in schools, it could fall everywhere, including at the ballot box. And then the movement exploded into the streets. By the mid-1950s, a new generation of activists was done waiting for the courts to slowly deliver justice. They wanted direct action, mass mobilization, the kind of pressure that couldn't be ignored. And it started with a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. In December 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a city bus. Her arrest sparked a year-long boycott of Montgomery's bus system, led by a young minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. The boycott worked. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. But more importantly, the boycott proved that ordinary black citizens, organized and determined, could force powerful institutions to change. King and others saw the potential. If they could desegregate buses, they could fight for voting rights too. In 1957, King and other leaders founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, an organization dedicated to nonviolent direct action. Their goal was simple: register as many black voters as possible and use that political power to dismantle Jim Crow. But registering voters in the Deep South in the late 1950s was incredibly dangerous. In places like Mississippi, Alabama, and rural Georgia, attempting to register could get you fired from your job, evicted from your home, or killed. White mobs attacked registration drives. Police arrested organizers on bogus charges. And the federal government still did almost nothing to protect black citizens exercising their constitutional rights. In 1960, a new wave of activists, many of them college students, launched the sit-in movement. Black students sat at whites-only lunch counters and refused to leave until they were served. The movement spread like wildfire from Greensboro, North Carolina, to Nashville, Tennessee, to dozens of cities across the South. Thousands of young people were arrested, beaten, and jailed. But they kept coming back. Out of that energy came the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, pronounced SNCC. These were young, fearless organizers who believed in putting their bodies on the line. And starting in 1961, they turned their focus to voter registration. SNCC workers moved into the most dangerous, most segregated counties in the South, places where no black person had successfully registered in decades. They went door to door, helping people fill out forms, teaching them how to pass the rigged literacy tests, and preparing them for the violence that would inevitably come. One of the most dangerous places was Mississippi. In the early 1960s, less than 7% of eligible black voters in Mississippi were registered. In some counties, the number was 0. SNCC organizer Bob Moses moved to the state in 1961 and began running voter registration schools in the Mississippi Delta. He was arrested multiple times. He was beaten so badly he was hospitalized. And still, he stayed. The workers faced unimaginable violence. In 1961, Herbert Lee, a black farmer who'd been helping Moses register voters, was shot and killed in broad daylight by a white state legislator. The killer was never charged. The next year, SNCC worker Jimmy Travis was shot while driving through Mississippi. He survived, but the message was clear. If you tried to register black voters, you risked your life, and yet people kept coming. By 1964, hundreds of volunteers, many of them white college students from the North, poured into Mississippi for what became known as Freedom Summer. Their goal was to register as many black voters as possible and to shine a national spotlight on Mississippi's brutal repression. The state responded with a wave of terror. Volunteers were beaten, churches were burned, and 3 young activists, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by a mob that included local police officers. Their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam weeks later. The murders shocked the nation. Suddenly, white Americans who'd ignored Southern violence for decades couldn't look away. But even with national attention, Mississippi still blocked black voters at every turn. The violence didn't stop the movement. If anything, it made the activists more determined, because they knew they were forcing the country to choose. Either America would live up to its promises of democracy, or it would admit that those promises were a lie. The turning point came in Selma, Alabama, a city where brutal repression met a movement ready to explode onto the national stage. By 1965, Selma had become a symbol of everything wrong with Southern voting laws. The city was more than 50% black, but only 2% of eligible black voters were registered. The local sheriff, Jim Clark, was a violent racist who arrested activists by the hundreds and encouraged his deputies to beat protesters in the streets. The registration office was open only 2 days a month, and black applicants were subjected to impossible literacy tests that they were designed to fail. In January 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC came to Selma to launch a voting rights campaign. For weeks, they marched to the courthouse every day demanding the right to register. Sheriff Clark responded with mass arrests. On one day alone, he arrested more than 250 protesters, including school children. The images of police dragging peaceful marchers into paddy wagons made national news, but still, the registration office stayed closed. Then, on the night of February 18, 1965, state troopers attacked a group of protesters in the nearby town of Marion. In the chaos, troopers shot and killed Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young black man who'd been trying to protect his mother from a beating. Jackson's death ignited outrage across the movement. Activists decided they needed to do something bigger, something that would force the federal government to act. They would march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, a 54-mile journey, to confront Governor George Wallace and demand voting rights. On March 7, 1965, about 600 marchers set out from Selma. They walked through the city and onto the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a steel arch bridge that crossed the Alabama River. On the other side, a wall of state troopers and sheriff's deputies waited for them. The marchers were led by John Lewis, a young SNCC leader, and Hosea Williams from the SCLC. As they reached the top of the bridge, the troopers ordered them to disperse. The marchers knelt to pray, and then the troopers attacked. They charged into the crowd with billy clubs and bullwhips. They fired tear gas into the mass of people. Troopers on horseback trampled protesters as they tried to flee. John Lewis's skull was fractured. Dozens of others were beaten so badly they had to be hospitalized. The violence was savage, and it was all caught on camera. That night, ABC interrupted its broadcast of a movie to show footage of the attack. Millions of Americans watched in horror as state troopers beat peaceful, unarmed marchers on a Sunday afternoon. The day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it changed everything. Protests erupted in cities across the country. Religious leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens demanded that the federal government intervene. The movement had forced the nation to see what black Southerners had been enduring for generations. 2 days later, on March 9th, King returned to Selma to lead another march. This time, thousands of people joined, including hundreds of white clergy from across the country. But when they reached the bridge, King made a controversial decision. He led the marchers in prayer and then turned them around, avoiding another violent confrontation. Some activists were furious, but King knew he needed a federal court order to protect the marchers before they could complete the journey. That night, white supremacists attacked a group of white ministers who'd come to support the march. They beat Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister from Boston, so badly that he died 2 days later. Reeb's death, following so closely after Bloody Sunday, intensified the national outcry. The violence in Selma was now the biggest story in America. On March 15, 1965, just over a week after Bloody Sunday, President Lyndon Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress. In one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered by an American president, Johnson demanded that Congress pass a voting rights bill immediately. He condemned the violence in Selma and called the right to vote the most basic right in a democracy. And then, near the end of the speech, he said something that stunned the nation. He invoked the movement's rallying cry, saying, "And we shall overcome." Martin Luther King, watching on television, wept. For the first time, the President of the United States had publicly sided with the civil rights movement, and he wasn't just offering words, he was demanding action. 2 days later, on March 21st, the march from Selma to Montgomery finally began, this time with the protection of federal troops and the Alabama National Guard, which Johnson had federalized. Over 5 days, the marchers walked through rain and heat, growing from a few hundred to more than 25,000 by the time they reached the state capitol. King spoke to the crowd in front of the Capitol building, declaring that segregation was on its deathbed and that the arc of the moral universe, though long, bends toward justice. But the victory came with a price. That night, Viola Liuzzo, a white mother of 5 from Michigan who'd come to help drive marchers back to Selma, was shot and killed by Ku Klux Klan members as she drove along a dark highway. Her murder was a brutal reminder that even as the movement won, the forces of white supremacy would fight to the bitter end. Still, the pressure worked. On August 6, 1965, less than 5 months after Bloody Sunday, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. It was one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history, and it came about because Black Americans had refused to stop fighting. The Voting Rights Act didn't just nibble around the edges of the problem. It struck directly at the core of voter suppression. The law banned literacy tests nationwide. It banned poll taxes in federal elections, and 2 years later, the Supreme Court struck down poll taxes in state elections, too. But the most powerful part of the law was Section 5, which required certain states and counties with histories of discrimination to get federal approval before changing any voting laws. This was called pre-clearance, and it meant the federal government could stop discriminatory laws before they took effect. The law also sent federal examiners into counties where less than 50% of eligible voters were registered. These examiners had the authority to register voters directly, bypassing the racist local officials who'd blocked black citizens for decades. In places like Selma, where registration had been nearly impossible, federal examiners registered thousands of people within weeks. The impact was immediate and massive. In Mississippi, black voter registration jumped from 7% before the law to nearly 60% within 3 years. In Alabama, it went from 19% to 57%. Across the South, hundreds of thousands of black citizens registered to vote for the first time, and they used that power immediately. In 1966, just a year after the Voting Rights Act passed, black voters helped elect the first black state legislators in the South since Reconstruction. In 1968, black turnout helped swing the presidential election. But the transformation went deeper than numbers. For the first time since the 1870s, black Southerners had real political power. They elected black sheriffs in counties where sheriffs had once led the Klan. They elected black mayors in cities that had violently resisted integration. They forced white politicians to stop ignoring black communities if they wanted to win elections. The entire structure of Southern politics shifted. One of the most striking examples was in Selma itself. In 1965, before the Voting Rights Act, black citizens couldn't even register. By 2000, Selma had a black mayor and a majority black city council. The bridge where John Lewis was beaten became a national historic landmark. The city that had symbolized racist violence became a symbol of the movement's victory. And it wasn't just the South. Black voters in northern and western cities used their growing power to demand better schools, housing, and jobs. The movement for voting rights became part of a larger fight for economic and social justice. Black political power reshaped debates over welfare, criminal justice, and civil rights across the country. But the fight didn't end in 1965. The Voting Rights Act was a triumph, but it was also fragile. Almost immediately, opponents looked for ways to weaken it. Southern states that had relied on literacy tests and poll taxes began experimenting with new tactics. They gerrymandered districts to dilute black voting power, packing black voters into a few districts or spreading them across many so their votes couldn't decide any elections. They switched from district-based elections to at-large systems where candidates had to win citywide or countywide, making it harder for black candidates to win. They closed polling places in black neighborhoods, forcing voters to travel long distances. They purged voters from the rolls for minor reasons, like missing a single election. These tactics were subtler than the old methods, but they had the same goal: reduce black political power. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act caught many of these schemes, blocking hundreds of discriminatory laws before they could take effect. But enforcing the law required constant vigilance. Civil rights groups had to sue again and again to stop states from chipping away at voting rights. In 1982, Congress renewed the Voting Rights Act and strengthened it, making it easier to challenge discriminatory laws even if they didn't explicitly mention race. The law was working, and both political parties, at least publicly, supported it. In 2006, President George W. Bush signed another reauthorization, passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities in Congress. But then, in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted the law. In a case called Shelby County versus Holder, the court struck down the formula that determined which states and counties had to get federal preclearance before changing their voting laws. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority, argued that the formula was outdated because it was based on decades-old data. He claimed that voter discrimination was no longer a serious problem, and that treating Southern states differently violated principles of equal sovereignty among the states. The decision was a disaster. Within hours of the ruling, Texas announced a strict voter ID law that had previously been blocked under Section 5. Other states followed with a wave of new restrictions. They purged millions of voters from the rolls, closed polling places in black and Latino neighborhoods, and implemented voter ID laws that made it harder for poor and minority voters to cast ballots. Studies showed that these laws reduced turnout among black voters, just as opponents of the laws had warned. The Shelby decision proved something crucial. Voting rights aren't permanent. They require constant protection. The mechanisms that black Americans fought and died to create in the 1960s were dismantled by a Supreme Court that decided voter suppression was no longer a real threat, even as it was happening in real time. Today, the fight continues. States pass restrictive voting laws every year. Activists sue to stop them, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. Efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act stall in Congress, blocked by partisan gridlock. And meanwhile, the hard-won gains of the 1960s are slowly being eroded. But the lesson of history is clear. Voting rights were never given freely. They were won by people who refused to accept disenfranchisement, who marched knowing they'd be beaten, who organized knowing they'd be arrested or killed. People like Fannie Lou Hamer, who after being beaten in that Mississippi jail cell, kept registering voters, like John Lewis, who walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge even though he knew state troopers were waiting with clubs, like the thousands of activists whose names we'll never know, who risked everything to force America to live up to its promise of democracy. The Voting Rights Act didn't happen because politicians suddenly became enlightened or because the system corrected itself. It happened because black Americans made it impossible for the country to ignore the truth. They turned voter suppression into a national crisis. They made segregation so morally indefensible that even reluctant politicians had to act. They proved that when people organize, sacrifice, and refuse to give up, they can break even the most entrenched systems of oppression. And that's the real story. Not that the law changed on its own, but that a movement forced it to change. Not that justice arrived naturally, but that people fought for it, step by agonizing step, until they won. The fight for voting rights is the story of American democracy itself, a reminder that every right we have was won by someone who came before us and refused to back down. That fight isn't over. It never really ends, because the forces that want to restrict voting rights never fully disappear. They adapt. They find new tactics. They wait for moments of weakness. But the lesson remains. Rights are protected by vigilance, by organizing, by people willing to stand up when those rights are threatened. The activists of the 1950s and 60s didn't just win the vote. They showed the rest of us how to fight for democracy itself. And as long as people remember that lesson, as long as they're willing to march, to organize, to demand that their voices be heard, the struggle that began in the streets of Selma and the churches of Mississippi will continue, because voting rights aren't just about casting a ballot. They're about power, and power once won must always be defended. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more history documentaries.